right, so next up we have Accelerating Women Leadership, which is very appropriate, obviously, for this day and this weekend. We have Valerie Alexander here to speak with us. She's an author, she's a public speaker, she's an activist for women in business, women activating their leadership and internally motivating to be the external woman of the world. So here's a woman of the world. I'm going to turn it over to her, and then we'll do the same process. So get your questions ready as you're listening to her. There you go.
Thank you, Tess. How many times have you been at a table full of decision makers, and I won't say you're necessarily the only woman, but you're greatly outnumbered by the men? Has that ever happened to anyone in this room? And are you sitting there possibly thinking, oh, I hope I'm qualified to be here. I hope I'm good enough. I hope I'm going to contribute. What if they think I'm not? What if they don't think I'm good enough? What if I'm not as qualified as all these men around me? Do you ever think that? Does anyone ever feel that way when they're sitting at that table in that room? Yes. This is called the imposter syndrome. Thank you, Sarah, for agreeing. This is called the imposter syndrome. It's something that greatly plagues women over men. And the reason is that in the corporate world, in politics, in most organizational structures, the women are swimming against the current. We are swimming against the current, and the men are swimming with the current. And instead of thinking, we are becoming such strong swimmers, we look over at them and see how fast they're going, and we think, damn, that guy's a good swimmer. And what we're going to talk about for the next few minutes is why that is, why we're swimming against the current, why we feel that way, and what we as women can do to not let that happen. We don't have to behave like men to compete in that environment. But what we do have to do is see what gets rewarded in workplaces and adapt that behavior into our own approach to what we do. So let's go back to why they're swimming with the current and we're swimming against the current. And when I start talking about this, if there's men in the room, they always say, oh, women always say that. They think it's harder for them and easier for us. But when you hear how all corporate structures came about, you'll understand how this happened. So we're going to go back 2 million years. 2 million years ago, we took a giant leap forward and we became hominids, which means every one of us was no longer, we walk on 2 feet and we're no longer covered with fur. And our ancestors, the first people to do this were the Homo habilis, and they did all kinds of cool things. They developed tools, they developed language, and they started living in tribes, and they pretty quickly figured out that the women were more valuable to the tribe than the men. And I'll explain why. If your tribe has 10 men and 10 women, if your tribe has 10 men and 10 women, and 10 women go off and fight in a war, and only 2 come back, your tribe's going to die out. 2 women cannot reproduce a tribe so that the tribe survives. But if 10 men go off and fight in war, and only 2 come back, tribe's fine. 2 men with 10 women can reproduce a tribe, and happily. So what happened is the tribes that wanted to survive and thrive and protect greater territory and hunt bigger animals figured out pretty quickly, don't let the women die. So what that meant was that the men went out to do the things that might cause death. They went out to hunt the big meat and protect the cave. And the women stayed back and did absolutely everything else. Every single other thing, every other task to enable the survival of the tribe was done by women. And as that was happening, our brains began evolving. And they didn't just begin evolving, they began exploding. Our brains went from being about the size of a meatball to being the cauliflower head that each of us has right now. And they didn't just do that. They added compartments. They added compartments because we had new things. We had tools that we had to instinctively know how to use. We had language that we were developing that didn't exist before. And after we'd specialized by gender, our brain added a prefrontal cortex. And this little processing center up here controls our emotions, our decision making, and our social interaction. So let's think about that. At a point in human history where all that mattered was survival, and that means biological survival. That means you live long enough to pass your genes on to the next generation. At that point in human history, when our brains started evolving for survival, we were already specialized by gender. And the men who were most likely to survive, which biologically means pass their genes on to the next generation, which means they got to mate, were the ones who were the most successful at hunting meat and protecting the cave. The women who were most biologically successful were the ones who could keep their offspring alive. They were the ones who were most successful at multitasking and consensus building and getting group agreement. And our brains evolved with these two separate sets of instincts. There is enormous amounts of research now about the male brain and the female brain. They are different. There's different areas of the brain that light up for different tasks. There's different areas of the brain that are different sizes. When a woman is given a business problem under what's called fMRI, which is a functional MRI, where we can watch the brain function, when a woman is given a business problem, the synapses in her brain shoot from side to side, which is how our brains react when we're doing something analytical. When a man is given the same business problem, the synapses in his brain shoot front to back, which is how our brains react when we want to leap into action. The male instinct is to leap into action, and the female instinct is to analyze. And what happened is about 20,000 years ago, combat between tribes evolved into commerce between tribes. But since the men were the only ones going out into the world, the men were only engaging with other men. And so all systems of commerce got built on their natural instincts. If you were going to build a system from the ground up, wouldn't it reward your natural instincts? So all systems of commerce were built to reward those same survival traits that caused you to succeed at hunting and combat, which is quick decision making, aggression, competition, the ability to be completely at rest when not in use. If a man and a woman are alone in a room together and nothing's happening, what's the worst thing she can ask him? What are you thinking? Because the answer is nothing. And that's fine. That's fine. That was a survival skill. If you had to sit behind a rock for 3 days waiting for a woolly mammoth to ramble by, you needed to be able to shut your brain down. If you were in a foxhole for 2 weeks waiting for the action to start again, you need to not be making to-do lists the whole time. So it's okay that sometimes their brains are not active. That means if we need them to kill a saber-toothed tiger, they can do it. Women never had that in the evolution of our brains because we were responsible for every single other task, raising the children, caring for the sick, gathering, hunting small creatures, doing the early stages of agriculture, sewing the loincloths, keeping the fire burning. We had so much to do, and we were doing it as a group, that we were building consensus. Was anybody here at the luncheon, the Women in Politics, speaking about? Okay. They were talking about how when women are part of the organization, consensus and cooperation comes into it. That was 2 million years in the making. That's not an accident. That's not because, our hormones are different. That's because our instincts are different. And our instincts are based on our survival skills. And our survival skills are based on not only what encourages the survival of the individual and the family, but the survival of the tribe. So if we want to succeed in a system that was completely designed to reward those survival skills, there's very small ways we can adapt without behaving like men. We don't want to lose the value we're bringing to the table. We bring so much value by wanting to build consensus. We bring so much value by considering inclusion greater than exclusion. But we have to get to the table. And when we get there, we have to be listened to. And those are things we can do. The most highly rewarded trait in any corporate organization is quick decision making. It is better to decide quickly and be wrong than to not decide until you're 100% right. And I know that's a hard thing for women to accept, because what we have to do is have faith in our own ability to make decisions. If someone asks you a question, what career are you in? What field? Yes, either of you. Okay. So Compassion Games, is that an athletic, are there athletic endeavors involved with that, or? Okay. If someone said to you, we need 100 people to show up next weekend for this event, can you do that? Are you just going to say yes? Or will you say, let me see, let me make some calls, let me find out? Chances are the answer is yes, and you know the answer is yes. And yet we stop ourselves as women from saying yes unless we're 100% sure. What you want to do is do quick risk analysis. What's the problem? What if I get the wrong answer? Or what answer is going to cause the highest risk? But give an answer. And then go find out if you're right. And if it turns out you're not right, you come back and you say, I did a little more research and I've solved your problem. You never use the words, I was wrong. You say, here's the problem with what we just discussed, but I've solved it for you. Because the second most valuable person in any organization, the second most highly valued trait is problem solving. We so much more highly reward the person who puts out the fire than the person who saw the hazard and prevented the fire from ever happening in the first place. And women are far more likely to prevent the fire from ever happening in the first place, but then we don't step in and put it out when it does. So that trait, preventing fire, awesome. Keep that. Keep doing that. But when the fire starts, be the one who puts it out. And make sure you get credit for it. Because that's the other thing we do. I'm going to go through two quickly because I want to open this up to a greater discussion, but there's two more things that are highly, highly rewarded in the workplace that women have to really adapt our behavior so that we can succeed at this. The first thing is the language with which we present things. Has anyone here ever been in a room where a woman opens her comment with, I might be wrong, but... Or even less damaging, does everyone agree? Even as you hear it, you're probably not thinking, that's not that damaging. Does everyone agree that we should have the meeting on Tuesday instead of Wednesday? Except if no one agrees and you're right, you've just forfeited the ability to defend your position. So if you're going to make a statement, here's how it starts. Here's what I think. And then you pause for just a beat so that everybody has to acknowledge that you just said something and pay attention and say, oh, what do you think? Or, more powerfully, I've done a lot of research on this topic, and here's how I think we should proceed. Here's the solution I'd like to propose, and I'd like us to discuss it before we move on. Now, why is that important? You force everyone to discuss your proposition, and then 2 minutes later, when a man says the exact same thing you just said, everyone will know that they've already discussed it and it came from you. Because again, how many times have any of us been in a room where a woman or you said something, everybody dismissed it, and then not even 2 minutes later, a man said it, and everybody said, well, let's talk about that. Make them talk about it when you say it. And again, it doesn't have to be aggressive. You don't have to be a bull about it. You say, these are my opinions on this topic. In the workplace, confidence and competence are perceived as the same trait. A woman who is highly competent but lacks confidence will not be perceived as competent. And a man, or anyone, I'm not going to make this male-female, anyone who is highly confident can go years without anybody realizing how incompetent they are. If you proceed with competence, fake it till you make it. Proceed with confidence, Proceed with confidence, and you will own the room, and you will be rewarded. So it goes to making quick decisions, putting out the fires, speaking with the language of authority. And here is the last thing that women really need to embrace, because it's not instinctive to us. And when I say it's not instinctive to us, I want to point out how not instinctive it is. In a study with 6-year-old boys, a group of 6-year-old boys was left alone to play for an hour, unsupervised. After an hour, they separated them, and they said, okay, who is in charge? Who is most in charge? Who is least in charge? How in charge was each person? Just make a list all the way down. Every boy made a list, and their lists were virtually identical. They did the same experiment with 6-year-old girls. And after an hour, they separated them and said, who was most in charge? Who was least in charge? And the 6-year-old girls had no idea what they were talking about. They said, what do you mean, who was in charge? We were playing. Nobody was in charge. Hierarchy is instinctive to men. Because if you're going to survive at combat, you know who's in charge, who do I answer to, who do I listen to, who says duck when I duck, you know? That instinct got brought into the corporate world. It got brought into politics. It got brought into religion. It got brought into almost all organizations. And where it really affects women is that we step out of the hierarchy to be helpful. We see something that needs to get done, and we go make sure it gets done without stopping to think, is that my job? Which sounds awful. Nobody wants to work with the person who says, that's not my job. But guess what? If that's not your job, and you step over to do it, there's a void where your job is, and somebody is happy to step into it. Hierarchical structures matter in terms of advancing in a workplace. And so just be aware of the hierarchy. Know where you are on the totem pole. Know who is above you, know who is beneath you, and don't do something that is not at your level unless it moves you up.